even as smart as you may be or as well-informed as you may be, just develop a little humility that you may not know everything. And you begin to engage people in respectful conversation about different ideas that help meet the goals and the principles you've already established. When this is well done, conflict can push thinking to a higher level and bring out better solutions than any one party had to begin with, and that's our experience.
That's Rob Fersh. He's the founder of the Convergence Center for Policy Resolution and has spent over 45 years moving public policy forward in Washington, D.C. He's also the co-author of the book From Conflict to Convergence, Coming Together to Solve Tough Problems. So you'll learn 1, how to find shared goals to move past differences. 2, the best way to deal with defensiveness. And 3, what to do when you just fundamentally disagree. And if you want to get a quick summary recap of these takeaways, I recommend you sign up for the free Gold Nugget email newsletter at awesomeatyourjob.com. I'm Pete Bukaitis. This is How to Be Awesome at Your Job. And now, here's Rob. Rob, welcome.
Thanks, Pete. Nice to be here.
I'm excited to dig into some of your goodness here. And I'd love it if you could start us with a juicy, dramatic story of a super difficult conflict that you mediated and how you ended up resolving things.
Well, thanks, Pete. There's a lot of stories to tell, but maybe the most dramatic is the one that opens the book that Mariah Levison and I have written called From Conflict to Convergence. And it was really my maiden voyage in trying to be a bridge builder on big national policy issues. So I had an idea back in the early 2000s that if we could only bring together all the people whose disagreements stood in the way of extending coverage to millions of Americans who didn't have it, that there'd be an opportunity to potentially create a breakthrough, because at that time, 40 to 50 million Americans were estimated to be without healthcare coverage at any point in time. And also, this was just a few years after, in the Clinton administration, an attempt to reform healthcare led by Hillary Clinton failed miserably and divided the entire healthcare field and people opposing and supporting their ideas. So we actually pulled together all the leading stakeholders on healthcare, and they agreed, left to right, that people ought to have healthcare coverage. The disagreement was how to do it. So we brought together the hospitals, the insurers, the pharmaceutical companies, consumer groups, unions, you name it, people who's are all influential stakeholders in healthcare policy in this country. And we attempted to break this decades-old gridlock on how to cover the uninsured. This group met 12 times over 2 years in an attempt to try to break the gridlock on how to cover the uninsured. And eventually they came up with a series of ideas that formed the basis for expanding coverage to people in the United States based upon shared values. We had, the Heritage Foundation, a very conservative foundation, was at the table, U.S. Chamber of Commerce, various unions and liberal advocacy groups and so on. But they all came together to design what became the architecture of efforts to improve healthcare coverage in the country. And I think my favorite story out of that is, as I said in the book, there was a representative of the American Medical Association at the table by the name of Carla Willis, who was their chief economist. And she'd been very outspoken in early meetings trying to forward the ideas the American Medical Association had developed. But I noticed over this 2-year period, Carla had gotten quieter and quieter. And finally, at the 11th meeting of this group, where they actually looked like that day they would seal the deal on the design of how to cover the uninsured in a way that bridged the divides across the left and right, Carla came up to me at a lunch break and said to me, "Rob, you have ruined my life." But she said it with a smile, and I responded in kind and said something like, "I hear that all the time. How in particular have I ruined yours? I do have 4 kids after all." And she said, "I've been sitting here for the last 2 years. The AMA and I had come up with very thoughtful proposals. I thought I understood all the issues and all the different approaches, and our ideas were best. Now I've been sitting here for 2 years hearing all these intelligent, well-meaning, thoughtful people say things I never thought of, and I can't see the world the same way." And in a sense, she was saying, even though the final proposals included some AMA ideas, she epitomized what we're trying to do in this work, which is to have people who have disagreements about how to solve problems expand their worldviews, not relinquish their principles, but begin to see ways to have their underlying interests met in a way that might be different than what they were positioning themselves to support, but in a way that did not sacrifice the principles and the values they had. So that was a pretty dramatic opening act for me as a bridge builder to help pave the way for multiple pieces of legislation that expanded healthcare coverage in this country.
Wow, that sounds amazing to hear anyone say that. That's about as much as you can hope for, I suppose, when you're doing this kind of work. So that's powerful. And can you share, what do you think were some of the core principles that made that possible?
Thanks for that. The essence of the work, and it's interesting, one of the participants at that table came from the Heritage Foundation. His name is Stuart Butler, very much someone who wanted private solutions, not so much government solutions, but having been born in Great Britain, he also believed in universal health care. So he was a very interesting person to have in the room. And here's what Stuart would say. He said, look, I've been battling people for years on healthcare. And what was different about this process is that although we thought we knew each other, we really didn't know each other. So this process, which allowed us to understand the values, concerns, and interests of people underneath all the different positions they take, to allow people to go deep and understand how they came to believe what they believed, and to feel a sense of shared mission, which they did have, to solve problems was really important. So there's some of the key elements of this process are to at least have a shared vision, and there was that. And this group said, we're going to cover as many people as quickly as possible. And that was agreed upon. No one said it has to be single payer like Canada or Great Britain. No one said it had to be every last person, but as many people as quickly as possible. The second piece was to build relationships across people so they understood each other deeply. And with that comes trust. Trust that the intentions of other people are things you can work with. In most cases, people want the same things, disagree on how to get there. And that process actually demonstrated that building relationships with trust could break through decades-old disputes some people in the room had with others and find areas of common ground that were significant, even though disagreements remained. And in fact, some of the ideas that eventually became law were not necessarily fully included in our consensus. But what we did was to move the ball forward to get people much closer to the point where they were very near agreement on how to cover the uninsured in this country. And in fact, what we did design was what people call the architecture of what became the Affordable Care Act, even though the Affordable Care Act went a little further than what our group recommended.
Okay, so that does sound novel, as opposed to how do we normally go at it when we have different viewpoints on a matter?
Yeah. So what's normally done, and I was part of this in the Washington culture, is that people who disagree get invited to all sorts of webinars and seminars, and people set them up for debate. And then everybody unloads about what they believe, and they may be polite or they may be impolite. And people then summarize what the disagreement was. But it's pretty rare that people take the time to go underneath that, to understand what drives people, what life experiences led them to believe the things they did, and to understand what their underlying interests were. And this is an idea that Bill Urey and Roger Fisher and others, Bruce Patton, in Getting to Yes, distinguished a long time ago, which is the difference between positions and interests. Positions tend to be hard and fast ways that people want to solve a particular problem, but underneath that are your interests, your needs. And what we've done is, I think, allowed people to have a conversation which almost never starts about debating positions about how to solve a problem, but getting underneath it all. What are your values? What are your interests? What are your concerns? And when you begin to identify them, there's usually any number of pathways that can satisfy interests. And our goal, different than many other political battles or other discussions that go on, was to try to meet the widest range of interests, create the so-called win-win solutions for people. Again, not necessarily requiring everyone to agree on everything, but to find wide swaths of agreement that have people leaving whole, feeling their needs are being met, and to understand that just for their needs to be met, other people do not necessarily have to lose, that you can set up situations where multiple people and multiple groups' needs can be met. So that's what distinguishes our approach from a lot of the normal give and take in Washington and the state houses and other places around the country.
Okay. Well, let's see. The United States health insurance coverage is among the most complicated things on the earth today. So perhaps could you give us a nice illustrative example of this positions versus interests and going deep to unearth them in perhaps a simple example that we can all understand, like, oh, okay, that's a position, that's an interest, and I can see how you've crafted a thing that's meeting people that have almost the opposite, it seems, positions are getting a win-win in terms of their interests being fulfilled.
we have an issue in the United States, which is called long-term care, which is the non-healthcare related services and that you provide to elderly and disabled people who cannot take care of themselves. And we do have a crisis in that many people only rely on family members to take care of them, can't necessarily afford coverage. So we were approached by a group of leaders in that field to convene a group. And, the positions of some people was that it's got to be a private sector response. It's got to be insurance. And that's how we're going to get home. Let's keep the government out of it. And then there were people who said, you know what? Long-term care is a terrible issue. It's bankrupting families. The needs aren't being met. Let's move to some massive new government program, a la Social Security, tax everybody, create a huge program on how to cover people who face this crisis. It's not everybody. It's not even a majority of the public. And so you had two very opposing points of view. One was market-based solutions only, and one was government-based solutions only. So their positions were, for some people, let's set up a new Social Security type of insurance for the entire country. And the other people said, no, let's just tweak the private insurance system. And so we were at loggerheads for a while, and then we took a break, and other groups working on this and helped design a study that Milliman, an actuarial group, and the Urban Institute did together. And the study showed that private insurance is never going to make it happen all the way, and that there were some issues with going public all the way. And eventually these groups found a way to combine a mixture of public and private approaches to allow people to get long-term care coverage as they needed. These ideas are still pending in Congress. They haven't yet moved forward, but there's a lot of attention to it. But underneath it all, people found, based upon studies and information they had, that each of their own solutions weren't sufficient. And it set the stage for them to find compromises to take the best from private insurance to try to make that stronger, and to also have the government help take care of the catastrophic costs that make the private insurers more viable, and also to provide coverage to people through the public as necessary. So I hope that was close enough to home to make the case for the distinction between positions and interests.
And so there, it seems like you had some progress because you had some independent research which said, hey, see how neither one of you are really going to get where you want to go by doing just your position. So that's handy. Although I imagine it takes a little bit of prep work in order to get folks' hearts and minds to even be receptive to facts or research or data of any kind that is unfavorable to themselves. So how'd you get there?
Well, this was a number of years ago before, I think the loss of confidence in institutions and the debate about what's facts and what's alternative facts was as ripe as it is now. But I think we honestly got there because people realized in this particular debate, they were missing information. How effective, and with modeling, and again, by lining up two groups, one that leaned left and one leaned right to do the research, so it was trusted by people of all sides. There was a sense that they wouldn't be able to go further until they had more information. That's not true in all the work we do. Some cases, people feel they have enough information and have enough agreement on facts they can go forward, even if they don't agree on all the facts. So in this case, I think people just felt frustrated that they needed more information. They got curious, and they helped themselves design the study so that their various needs could be met and the questions they wanted answered could be met. So that's an unusual intervention, but it's also an important one given what we have today, which is a lot of disagreement on facts, a lot of people feeling that the other side isn't as honest or as forthcoming as they should be. So to the extent groups that are coming together to solve problems can agree upon trusted sources or help put together facts that they can all rely upon, that's an important step toward progress and agreement in any particular process.
And if your counterparts are not feeling curious and rather sort of dug in and solidified, or you yourself are not feeling curious, you're solidified, dug in, what are some of your perspectives on how to stir up that helpful curiosity?
Well, I would say a lot of people enter our rooms where their maybe shoulders are hunched, their arms are crossed, they're defensive. Many enter our room not in a collaborative frame of mind, to be honest. Some come for defensive purposes. We did a huge project on K through 12 education, where we had, the current president of the National Education Association, she was vice president then, and a woman on the West Coast who ran a conservative foundation who was known as a critic of teachers' unions and a supporter of more computers in the schools, which some people thought would take some teaching jobs away. And especially she was an advocate for school choice. And the woman on the West Coast, who was a conservative, basically said she came to the table not thinking much would happen. She's a woman of action, didn't believe in gab fests, as she kind of called them, and too much talk and not enough action. But when she got in the room and began to hear people as human beings and create relationships that weren't just about debating the issues, or breaking bread with people, hearing their life stories, I think it opens your hearts to understanding other people. So part of the way, I think, to foment curiosity, if you will, is to have people feel a connection to each other and to take an interest in each other. Beyond that, I think the process itself works that way. If you bring together people who can interact in goodwill, it doesn't mean that it doesn't get tense. It doesn't mean there aren't fierce debates at times, but who begin to see that they shared values and they share goals, which is how we start out. And oftentimes they develop some principles by which to guide it. Then people have a greater propensity to get curious because they've come to the table because they agree there is a problem that needs to be solved. And once they begin to also open their hearts the way Carla did in healthcare to see that they didn't have all the answers, that no one perspective or no one individual has all the wisdom, and they get that. And that happens almost automatically when people are in the room and there's skillful facilitation of conversation across differences. Usually it tickles something inside of them to want to learn more, not just to oppose blindly.
Rob, could you perhaps walk us through maybe a step-by-step in terms of, okay, we got two folks, they have wildly different positions on a matter, and we want to have some of those delightful breakthroughs, transformations, feel goods that you're describing on the other side. It seems like we've got a couple principles to work with regard to shared vision, shared values, as well as coming to some personal connection pieces and understanding the human and the what's underlying stuff. But could you share with us maybe, as much as it's possible, a generalized framework or step-by-step when you got conflicting positions and want to find some convergence? Here's step one, step two, step three.
I mean, the first step is to clarify, is there a shared goal to begin with? It's very hard to have people work together if they don't have a shared goal. But the fact that they share a goal, even if they disagree on how to get there, is a very important starting point for people to come to the table. So at least, and even that begins to build a little bit of trust that you're not at odds with someone about how the world should look. You just disagree on how to get there. So having a shared vision, a shared goal is a very important first step for people who seem to be in disagreement. After that, as we've talked about, having them get to know each other a bit, having them understand each other's values, their own life stories, what led them to believe what they believe is really important, and beginning to assemble some basic guidelines or principles by which they could potentially agree on, even though they continue to disagree. So we had a project on economic opportunity and mobility where we had the Chamber of Commerce and we had unions at the table, but they developed a principle that said, basically, if you work full time, you should have a life of dignity and basically not live in poverty. And yet underneath that, there was disagreement because people on the left in particular wanted more higher minimum wages, in fact, a big national minimum wage. And the Chamber and other business leaders said, no, that doesn't work for us. Too many regional variations, too much difference. But they also signed on to the principle that if you work, you shouldn't be living in poverty. You should at least be living in dignity. And that meant that they also, if they weren't going to do that solely through putting the costs on the employer, that they would be open to governmental changes, including things like the earned income tax credit or the child care tax credit, other things, because to adhere to that principle, they needed to do something besides just saying no to minimum wage. And so there was some movement there. So to review now, have a shared goal, begin to build relationships of trust, begin to understand each other's underlying values, and then engage in a conversation where you begin to go deep on the issues themselves and ask people to keep a mindset of curiosity, ask them to keep a mindset of giving others the benefit of the doubt, develop a mindset where in some ways you internalize that even as smart as you may be or as well-informed as you may be, just develop a little humility that you may not know everything. And you begin to engage people in respectful conversation about different ideas that help meet the goals and the principles you've already established. And our experience is that when this is well done, people can then push each other's thinking to a higher level. As William Ury said to you in his podcast, he said, we don't have enough conflict. And I don't know if I agree with that fully, but my point is that conflict can push thinking to a higher level and bringing out better solutions than any one party had to begin with. And that's our experience. So that's the basic process. Try to promote relationship, promote trust, promote curiosity, engage in respectful dialogue where you don't ever attack the person or their motives. You have ground rules by which you observe confidentiality. You allow people to make mistakes, knowing it's not going to go out of the room. And you try to listen in a way that really leads to constructive results and the full expression of different points of view as people push each other's thinking to a higher level and become attuned to understanding how they might meet each other's needs. There's an acronym in our book called OPTIONS. I never quite get it right, but it's really almost only proposals that meet others' needs succeed is the thrust of it. And when the whole group, whether it's two people or other people, become committed to not only meeting their own needs, but seeing that their needs can be met and others' needs can be met, you have an opportunity not only to solve problems better, but to create relationships that radiate over time constructively. People leave our processes often working together better for years to come because they now see each other and understand each other at another level.
That's fantastic. And when it comes to the understanding of individuals at a deeper level with regard to why did you believe or how did you come to believe that thing and understand who they are as people, are there any super powerful questions or exercises or activities that you engage in that helps unlock some of this interpersonal magic?
There's sort of two key questions, you can ask when someone else is talking is basically, did I get that right? And what am I missing? So if you can internalize that, using curiosity is a hugely important tool. And as I often kid, curiosity is not well expressed when you say to somebody, I'm curious. How the heck could you ever come up with that point of view to solve the problem? But if you can ask authentically curious questions of another person to learn, not to debate, to hear them out, you can always debate. You can always walk away later. You can always disagree vehemently. But if you can develop enough personal relationship where it's sort of natural, you get curious. Often people develop bonds of affection in the room, even though they used to be sworn enemies. Some of them, go to ball games together or call each other up when they want to make sure they're not just hearing from their own side in a way that blindly misses the other points. So this is the practice of curiosity in a skillful way where people begin to see that they can, despite their maybe being upset about what they're hearing, go to another gear, go to what Bill Urey calls the balcony to kind of look at this more dispassionately and not to get triggered by what the other person says, but committed to wanting to learn something. So that's a very important skill set for people.
So a poor question is, and that's not real curiosity, is how the heck did you come up with such a stupid point of view? Could you give us some illustrations of what a few good, quality, authentic, useful, genuine, curious questions look, sound, and feel like in their verbiage?
It would be something like, someone says, I think the only way to provide healthcare coverage is to go what Canada has. It's single payer and everybody's covered and the costs are down and so on. And you could respond from the hip saying, that's not American way. It's going to stifle innovation. It's going to get the government bureaucracies too much. But, you could go after them that way. But you could simply say, okay, what has been your experience with that particular approach? And why is it that you favor that? And is this something related to your own personal experience, or is it more a philosophical point of view? Please, I'm very curious about how you came to that set of beliefs and why you believe that. And if you ask that authentically, you'll learn something. You may still disagree with it totally, but you won't simply just go into a pitched battle of government, not government, private sector, not public sector, whatever. You begin to get into what we call complexifying an issue. And that's really important to begin to disrupt a little bit the sort of tightly held views people have. Again, not asking them to compromise their values, their principles in any way, but to see the issues a little more complex once they fully understand how reasonable people could take that view. And that's kind of how, because I've done this work the last 25 years or so, how I go through life now. Whenever I read an article that I either immediately disagree with or agree with, my first thought is, let me read something that's the opposing side. I'm sure there are reasonable people who disagree. I'm sure this isn't the full answer. And if you can internalize that at any given moment, no one has the full answer and there's always something to be learned, then that's an important move forward in your mindset to be a collaborative problem solver.
I like that notion a lot, the complexifying, because I think the human brain tends to like and prefer simple. We tend to like clear cut, black and white. But of course, this is how it is. And yet, if in fact reasonable people do have a differing point of view, then there is naturally going to be some complexity there. And if it feels simple in your brain, then perhaps it is indeed the case that you are missing something. And there is some complexification that is necessary for you to enter into in order to get to that place of understanding. Oh, okay. So that's why you think that.
So, Pete, that's exactly right. But let me also, for your listeners, because I think these ideas apply to businesses and nonprofits and philanthropies and certainly on the academic campuses widely. But I also want to make clear this approach we forward doesn't mean you necessarily talk to everyone about everything all the time. Sometimes there's not time for leaders to make decisions by consensus. You can have so-called death by consensus, drive itself nuts. And there also are people in groups who are so ideological, so wed to certain ideas, or may have some views that are so extreme, whether that be on race or other things, that they cannot necessarily come to the table, cannot open their heart. And you got to that a little bit to begin with. So that's where you have to have a shared goal. If you don't have a shared goal, like I used to say, not that I would ever been called upon, I wouldn't have suggested that Martin Luther King sit down with then, I think it was the sheriff or the law enforcement officer, Bull Connor in the South. If what King wanted was integration and economic opportunity, and he was facing a segregationist and there was just no room, then you can't necessarily pull people together when people are so extreme or so convinced they have the full truth. On the other hand, I would also say to you that on really tough issues where you know there can't be agreement, you can still use these processes to form relationships of trust and do some things that are just adjacent to the disagreement. So I have good friends who worked on the issue of abortion. And one friend had convened a bunch of people who are anti-abortion and pro-choice. And it was understood to begin with that on the fundamental issue of whether a woman would have a right to choose, there would be no agreement. There was a position of deep religious belief on one side in particular, but also a deep principled belief on the other. But these people were convened at a time when bombings were going on in abortion clinics and people were dying and tensions were running high. And the idea was to understand each other. And in the case of my colleague Mary Jackstein, as I understand it, she brought together these people on the auspices of Search for Common Ground. They began to understand each other. They began to understand that principled people could stand on either side, and that at least at a minimum, they stopped demonizing each other as inhuman or not in touch with the fundamental needs of others. And then in some cases, they actually found they could work together on things they shared, like teenage pregnancy prevention and better foster care and adoption systems should babies be brought to term. So even though they didn't reach agreement on the fundamental issue of abortion per se, they were able to develop respect for each other, live more civilly with each other, not live as if they're at war with each other, and then to find areas they could work on together, which they thought were socially positive. So I think that contributes to a more civil and effective society when we can bridge those divides, even if it's not solving the entire underlying problem.
That's cool. That's a cool example in terms of perhaps indeed the foundational viewpoints may be irreconcilable. Like this is a human being in the womb, or it is not. It's like, okay, well, I don't know what we can do with that when we have the opposite views, but maybe there's some other shared goals that we can rally around, and away you go.
So we talked about earlier about values and shared goals and listening and trust, but beyond that, when we do our work, we urge people to do their homework, and that's true if you're in a business or otherwise. Make sure you understand who the key players are, who you need to include to get the best possible answers. And we're all for inclusiveness of all the voices that are important, not just influentials and experts, but people with lived experience. So what we call mapping the terrain, understanding who believes what to begin with is really important, and doing your homework to understand who you need to convene. Then comes what I've already said, nurturing trust in the room, and we do that through a series of exercises. Never start by debating people's positions, but to understand each other. And then it's really important that everybody be heard, and really deeply, and listened to respectfully. And we reinforce that by what some of us call ground rules, where you don't go after people's motives, and you give people equal time or as much time as they need to be heard, and so on. And then with skillful help often, but this can be done within organizations, you ask people to begin to generate what we call options for mutual gain. And that's really an important part of the process. Yes, continue to forward things that are in your interest. I'll tell you one quick story which may surprise people. When I did my maiden voyage on healthcare, 2003 to 2006, we had an executive from a major pharmaceutical company, and there were people that were very skeptical of pharmaceutical companies writ large. But this gentleman, who was one of the top officials of this pharmaceutical company, earned the trust of everybody in the room by making, I believe at the opening meeting, a statement that says, my company has a huge interest in how we cover the uninsured. I know there's 40 to 50 million people in the country without insurance, but let me just say on behalf of my company, let's have a conversation about the best way to cover people. And let me worry about later what that does to the financial underpinnings of my company. But I really want to have a conversation in which we're part of a community trying to solve the problem in a way that does the most good for the most people. And we'll, if we need to fight it a little bit or demur, or we need to tweak it, let's come to that later. But he set a tone there, and this, I think, is a sign of great leadership that said, I'm open. I'm not going to be defensive. I want to listen. I want to learn. And hopefully we'll come out with solutions that work for everybody.
I like that principle a lot in terms of the deferring. It's like, yeah, y'all know I work for a pharmaceutical company and we're going to have to go ahead and maximize profits for them shareholders. That's sort of what we do. But we'll figure that out later. For now, let's see what the theoretical ideal is that we can all sort of move toward. And yeah, you may afterwards need to do some negotiation, some give and take, some horse trading, whatever, to make that workable for all of the parties. But to start with an initial goodwill commitment to get somewhere and then fine tune later, I think can be very helpful in many contexts.
Yeah. And again, it's in this case, I think enlightened leadership by this individual who's seemed to be a very wise man. Let me tell you just another story. The first project pretty much I ever did at Convergence was on nutrition and obesity. It was interesting because we had difficulty assembling a table. We got a table of public health and consumer groups and some major food companies. And about a week before the first meeting, which was pretty highly charged because a lot of these people had already been in prior discussions, as one food company executive said to me, I've never been in a discussion with the consumer groups where they didn't walk out in protest against big food. And this, he represented a big food company. So we assembled this group, and about a week before the first meeting, a leading voice on the consumer side wrote a blog or an op-ed basically saying, you know what, those of us who want to diminish and fight obesity and diabetes in this country need to stay pure to our principles. Of course, we need to talk to food companies because they're part of it, but let's make no mistake. Their interests are exactly what you said, Pete. It's to maximize shareholder profits, and so they can never be full partners. So fast forward. So immediately my inbox filled up with notes from outraged food business people who are coming to the table saying, is this guy really coming to the table? Does he understand how insulting that is, that we can't be part of a solution like we don't share goals to diminish obesity and diabetes? So we convened people. It was very highly charged in the room, and for a while pretty tense. But eventually, as we went around the room, I'm not here to blindly defend all food companies. Some are better than others in terms of their public spiritedness. But one after another, food company representatives said, you know what? We do have obligations to shareholders. On the other hand, we've got employees. We have family members. We have people who've lost limbs to diabetes and people who have terrible health problems. And we have healthcare costs for our companies that go up because people's diets aren't so great. We can't unilaterally disarm selling our products and just take away all our profits. But if we can make it so that serving healthier foods could be more profitable and marketable, then we would love to join as partners with other people. And we'd also love it if consumer groups would stop attacking us every time we try to do the right thing. Because whenever we do it, you're just skeptical and you come after us. So what happened was, over the next 36 hours, there was a remarkable level of frank dialogue about what were the needs and interests of companies and what were the needs and interests of consumer groups. And eventually, within a year or two, we did come out with a series of recommendations. But by the end of that meeting, the leading voice for the food industry, representing an umbrella group, said that she had learned a lot and that she really hoped to be able to work together with the group. And the fellow who'd written that op-ed that has stirred people up said, you know what, I'm not conceding anything at this point, but this conversation is going to make me think afresh about how to partner with the food industry, and I look forward to doing that. So this is about what it does when you understand, you complexify, and know that, just because someone works in a corporation doesn't mean they're evil and selfish. And if someone works in a consumer group doesn't mean they don't care about the thriving of corporations that help make services and goods available to people in this country. And the extent we can complexify their views of each other and make them a little less ideological in an honest process, not by lecturing them, but just by learning and experiencing, then you open doors for levels of collaboration that normally are not thought possible by a lot of people who think that we are divided everywhere into us and them. And that's not necessarily true.
Big thanks to Rob for sharing his wisdom with us. Big thanks to our sponsors. Check them out. One sponsor to check out is Acorns. If you've got a New Year's resolution to save more money this 2025, don't be among the 92% who fail. Become awesome at saving your money with Acorns. Acorns makes it easy to start automatically saving and investing, so your money has a chance to grow for you, your kids, and your retirement. You don't need to be an expert. Acorns will recommend a diversified portfolio that fits you and your money goals. You don't need to be rich. Acorns lets you invest with the spare money you've got right now. You can start with $5 or even just your spare change. And it doesn't take much time at all. I find the Acorns site and app to be beautiful, easy, convenient. NerdWallet rates them excellently, and so do I. So head over to acorns.com/awesome or download the Acorns app to start saving and investing for your future today. And a little disclosure here, paid on client endorsement, compensation provides incentive to positively promote Acorns. Tier 1 compensation provided. Investing involves risk. Acorns Advisors, LLC, an SEC-registered investment advisor. View important disclosures at acorns.com/awesome. One sponsor to check out is EarthBreeze. I recently saw a spooky documentary about the avalanche of plastic we throw away or try to recycle, but doesn't really get recycled. So I've been trying to cut back. And the most delightful way I've been cutting back has been foregoing those huge laundry detergent bottles for EarthBreeze detergent sheets. EarthBreeze detergent comes in convenient plastic-free packaging, so they're more eco-friendly than traditional detergent. And I just love how quick and easy and portable they are. I can keep some loaded in my suitcase for an Airbnb or travel laundry emergency. I'm ready. And I save a good 20 seconds of carefully trying to pour and measure liquid detergent into the machine by tossing a quick and easy sheet in there. I love their scent-free version, which is easy on my clothes and skin. So check out EarthBreeze for an easy way to get clean clothes without all the plastic waste. And get 40% off with your subscription at earthbreeze.com/awesome. That's earthbreeze.com/awesome. Well, Rob, in our last couple of minutes, could you share any top do's or don'ts for folks who are looking to be awesome at their jobs and thinking about some conflict things?
Well, I think the top do for me is no matter where you sit in your job, you can be a collaborative leader, whether you're the boss or not. You can always be a voice for saying, you know what, this is a tricky problem. Let's get everybody who's got a stake in the outcome in the room and try to listen. Let's try to push for ideas that work for as many people as possible. I had the great honor of working with Stephen Covey quite closely for a number of years, who was the author of The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People and probably the greatest promoter of the term win-win, which some people dismiss, I think, too easily. So I think developing a mindset that for me to win, others don't necessarily have to lose, that no one person or group holds all the answers, that there's always something to be learned, and if I can learn to be curious, then I think there may be ways to get through things that are really important. I think the don'ts are to check your ego at the door, make sure that you're as centered as possible. That's another do when you're interacting with other people. Take care of yourself and make sure that you are not as reactive as you might be when you're meeting people who disagree with you. So don't take the bait. Don't get reactive. Do be passionate about your views, absolutely. But don't make the assumption that just because someone disagrees with you, that they're not a good person, don't have good values, don't have important things to say.
Rob, thank you. This has been enriching, and I wish you much pleasant convergence.
Thank you very much, Pete. A great pleasure to be on. People want to know more about our work, please look at the book, From Conflict to Convergence. And also at Convergence, we'd love to have people involved with us. We are doing problem solving ourselves, and then we have a whole new learning lab where we are And the book is part of that, where we're trying to inspire and equip people to be collaborative problem solvers. And we have an online training program coming on in the next few months where I think people who really want to pursue this can, in addition to reading the book, find ways to collaborate more effectively no matter what their station in life. So thank you for this opportunity.
I love what Rob has to say about complexifying something. And if you ever have the position that the other side is just an idiot or hates freedom or whatever, when it oversimplifies and awfulizes the other side, we're probably oversimplifying it. So let's complexify it, get a bit of understanding where they're coming from, and see where we can get to. And maybe we can't get that far because we fundamentally disagree about the foundational stuff we're about, but perhaps we can find some zone of shared goal and work toward that smaller goal in the meantime. Inspiring stuff from Rob. If you want to check out the show notes or the transcript or the links to items that we referenced, please drop on by awesomeatyourjob.com/EP1028. Hope to catch you next time, and peace.